Welcome to this lecture on building an admin panel using Filament in Laravel. In this session, we're going to walk through everything that has been covered so far, from setting up guards, creating panels, configuring login routes, all the way to understanding what still needs to be done for product entry and display on the front end. Let's dive right in. Let's start with a quick recap of what was accomplished in the previous session. 3 major things were done. First, the front end was partially built. The basic user interface was put together. Second, the data coming in from that front end was successfully saved to the database. And third, an admin panel was created using Filament. This sets the foundation for everything we're building on today. Now, one of the key things introduced in the previous session was the concept of guards in Laravel. Guards control how users are authenticated. By default, Laravel uses a single guard called Web for regular users. But when you're building an admin panel, you don't want admins and regular users sharing the same authentication system. So a separate guard called Admins was created specifically for the admin table. This means the admin panel is protected by its own guard, completely independent from the regular user login. Once the admins guard was created, it was assigned directly to the admin panel. What this means in practice is really important. If someone tries to log in or register from the front end of the website, they go through the regular web guard and land in the regular user area. But the admin panel is protected by the admins guard, so only users authenticated through that guard can access it. This separation is what was accomplished in the previous session, and it's a critical security design decision. Now, let's talk about the overall flow of the application. The idea is this. A shop owner visits the website, fills out a form, and submits it. That request comes to the server, the data gets saved to the database, and then, and this is the new part, an email should automatically be sent to the admin. So the admin knows that a new request has come in. This email notification step is what needs to be implemented next, and it's the focus of the upcoming work. Before implementing email notifications, there are 2 important things to understand about how email works in a Laravel application. The first is the server setup. This means deciding which mail service or driver will actually send the email. This could be something like SMTP, Mailgun, or SendGrid. Essentially, you need to configure from whose server the email is being sent. The second part is the email logic itself, what the email says, when it gets triggered, and who it gets sent to. Both of these pieces need to be in place before emails can work correctly. Now let's talk about Filament specifically. To get Filament working as an admin panel, there are 2 separate steps. First, Filament needs to be installed into the project, and in this case, it was already installed previously. Second, a panel needs to be created. Just having Filament installed is not enough. You need to actually create a panel, which is the admin interface itself. The command to create a panel is run via Artisan, and that's what was done next. When the panel creation command is run, Filament asks for a panel ID. Since the admin panel being built is for a shop, called Dokkan, the ID entered was Dokkan. Filament then automatically creates a Dokkan panel provider. This provider is essentially the configuration class for the panel. Importantly, the panel ID you enter also becomes the URL path for that panel. So if you enter Dokkan, the panel will be accessible at yoursite.com/Dokkan. This is a simple but important detail to keep in mind. After the panel is created, there are a couple of configuration details to handle. First, the path, which is set to Dokkan, defines the URL where the panel lives. This was confirmed and kept as is. Second, the login route needs to be explicitly added. Normally, the default admin panel in Filament includes a login page, but other panels you create might not have it by default. So the login route was manually added to the Dokkan panel provider. Registration, on the other hand, was intentionally left out. There's no need for public registration on the Dokkan panel. Only login is needed. At this point, someone might ask, we have an email, we have a password, and we've created the Dokkan panel. Can we just log in directly? The answer is not necessarily. There's something important to verify first. By default, Laravel's authentication guard points to the users table, but the admin panel is supposed to use the admins table. So if the panel hasn't been explicitly told to use the admins guard, it might be trying to authenticate against the wrong table entirely. This is the key thing that needs to be checked and configured before login will work correctly. The fix here is to explicitly configure the Dokkan panel provider to use the admins guard. Think of it as a chain. The panel needs to know which guard to use, and the guard knows which database table to look at for authentication. If the panel is using the default web guard, it will look in the users table and won't find the admin credentials. By pointing it to the admins guard, it correctly checks the admins table. This is a crucial configuration step that must be done before the admin login will work as expected. Now that the Dokkan panel is set up and the login configuration is being sorted out, the next major steps in the project become clear. Once the admin can log in, the next task is product entry. The admin needs to be able to add product data through the panel. After that, those products need to be displayed on the front end of the website so that visitors can see them. This View Products feature on the front end is what will be tackled in the next class session. So the roadmap is login works, then product entry, then front-end display. So continuing from where we left off, when an email notification needs to go out, the first question is who receives it and who sends it. In this case, the email is being sent to the admin, the person stored in the admin database table. That part is straightforward. But the trickier question is, what email address does the email come from? That sender address has to be configured first before any email can actually go out. This is why the process is broken into two clear steps. Step 1 is server setup, where you define the sender credentials. Step 2 is actually sending the email. Once the server's set up, that same configuration can be reused across all your projects, so you only do it once. Let's look at the two-step process more carefully. The first step is server setup. This is where you configure which mail server to use and what the from address will be, the email address that appears as the sender. The important thing here is that once this is set up, you don't need to do it again for every project. The same configuration code works across all your Laravel projects. For testing purposes, you'd use a test email account, and when you go to production, you'd swap it out for a real business email. The second step is actually sending the email. This involves two things: choosing the design of the email, meaning the template or view file, and passing the relevant database data into that design so it shows up in the email body. Now, when you send an email, you don't just send plain text, you send a designed template, and that template often needs to display real data from the database. For example, when a shop registration request comes in, the admin email should show the shop name, the owner's contact details, the message they wrote, and so on. So the flow works like this. The database data gets passed into a mail class, in this case something like token request notification, and that mail class is responsible for connecting the data to the email view, which is the actual HTML design of the email. The mail class acts as the bridge between your data and your template. To create the mail class in Laravel, you run the artisan command php artisan make mail, followed by the class name. Here, the class is named token request notification, a descriptive name that tells you exactly what this mail is for. Now, technically, you could send an email directly using Laravel's mail facade without creating a separate class. But using make mail is the recommended approach because it keeps your code organized. Each type of email gets its own dedicated class. This class will define two things: which view file to use as the email template and what data to inject into that template. Let's look at what the mailable class actually looks like. First, you declare a public variable, in this case called data, to hold whatever information you want to pass into the email. It's declared as public because Laravel automatically makes public variables available inside the email view template. Then in the constructor, you accept that data as a parameter and assign it to the public variable using this data equals data. Finally, the build method returns the view, pointing to the email template file. So when this class is called and data is passed in, it stores that data and renders it inside the specified view. This is the core pattern for all mailable classes in Laravel. Once the mailable class is built, calling it is straightforward. You use the mail facade, call the to method with the recipient's email address, and then chain the send method, passing in a new instance of your mailable class along with the data. Notice the array access syntax here. $data in square brackets with the key name. This is important. When data comes in as an array rather than an object, you use square bracket notation to access individual fields. If it were an object, you'd use the arrow notation. In Laravel, form-submitted data often comes as an array, so this distinction matters. The email address used as the recipient is pulled directly from the data that was submitted with the shop registration form. Here's an important detail. The credentials email should only be sent when the shop request is actually approved. Without a conditional check, the email would fire regardless of whether the admin approved or rejected the request, which would be a serious bug. So the code wraps the email sending logic inside an if statement that checks whether the status equals approved. Only when that condition is true does the system generate a password and send the credentials email. If the status is anything else, like rejected, no password is created and no email goes out. This is a critical piece of business logic that protects the integrity of the system. The token credential mailable class is slightly more complex because it needs to pass two separate pieces of data into the email template. The first is the shop registration data, name, email, contact number, and so on. The second is the generated password. So the class declares two public variables, data and password. The constructor accepts both as parameters and assigns them. Both variables are then automatically available inside the email view template. The view file for this email is stored in the mails folder and named credential, so it would be mails/credential.blade.php. This is the email that the shop owner receives with their login details after being approved. One thing that trips up a lot of developers is the difference between accessing array data versus object data in the email template. When the data passed into the mailable is an array, which is common with form submissions in Laravel, you access fields using square bracket notation. $ data in square brackets, then the key name in quotes. But if the data is an object, you'd use the arrow notation instead. Using the wrong one will cause errors. Inside the Blade email template, all public variables from the mailable class are directly available, so you can reference $data and $password without any extra setup. Just make sure you know whether you're working with an array or an object before writing your template. A practical issue that came up during development is spelling consistency. When you create a mailable class, the name you give it must be used exactly the same way everywhere, in the class definition, in the controller where you call it, and in the Vue file name. Even a small difference, like adding an extra letter or swapping 2 letters in the spelling, will cause a class not found error. Laravel is case sensitive, so domain credential and domain credentials are treated as completely different things. It's a simple mistake, but it can be frustrating to debug. The fix is straightforward. Just make sure the spelling is consistent across all 3 places: the class file, the controller call, and the Vue path. After wiring everything up, the final test is to actually check that the emails arrive correctly. Opening a Gmail account to receive the test emails, you should see 2 distinct emails. The first is the admin notification. This tells the admin that a new shop registration request has come in with all the relevant details from the form. The second is the credentials email. This one goes to the shop owner after the request is approved, and it contains their login details in a clean, well-designed HTML template. Testing with a second Gmail account is a practical approach during development. The key thing to verify is that the credentials email only arrives after an approval action, not after a rejection. The material also touches on Filament, which is a powerful Laravel admin panel package. Installing it requires just 2 commands. The first pulls the package in via Composer, and the second runs the Filament installer, which scaffolds the entire admin panel. What makes Filament valuable is that once installed, you get a fully functional admin interface for managing your database records without having to build those views from scratch. It integrates cleanly with Laravel and is especially useful for projects where you need a quick but polished backend management interface. The installation process is intentionally simple. Just those 2 commands and you're ready to go. Now let's talk about configuring the .env file for sending emails via SMTP. When you open your .env file, you'll see lines from 0 through 7 that need to be filled in with real data, not the demo placeholders that are already there. If you ever forget what goes where, just search something like send email Laravel SMTP in Chrome and you'll find the right configuration quickly. First, set mail mailer to SMTP. That goes right at the top. For mail host, use smtp.gmail.com. The port is typically 587, which is the standard secure port. Port 25 also exists, but 587 is what's normally used. Mail username is the email address you're sending from, and mail password is the special app password we'll generate in a moment. Mail from address is the same email again, and mail from name is the display name. If it has spaces, wrap it in double quotes. That's mandatory for names with spaces, and optional without. To get the password for your .env file, you need to generate a Google app password. Here's how it works step by step. First, go to your Google Account Manager. From there, search for 2-step verification and make sure it is turned on. This is a prerequisite. Without 2-step verification enabled, the app passwords option won't even appear. Once 2-step verification is on, search for app passwords in the same account settings. You'll see a field where you enter the name of your app or project. For example, the instructor used sudamb as the project name. Click Create, and Google will generate a 16-character password for you. Copy that password immediately and paste it into your .env file as the value for mail password, wrapped in double quotes. That's your SMTP password. It's not your regular Google account password. It's a special app-specific one. Here's an important debugging tip. Sometimes Laravel won't throw any error at all, but the email still doesn't arrive. When that happens, the first thing to do is go back and carefully check every single value in your .env file. Make sure mail mailer is exactly SMTP. Check that mail host is correct. A small typo here is easy to miss, especially when you're scrolling. Verify the port is 587. Confirm that mail username and mail from address are the same email. And most importantly, make sure mail password is the app password generated from Google, not your regular Google login password. Also, double check that 2-step verification is still enabled on the Google account. These small mismatches are the most common reason emails silently fail without any error message. Now let's look at how data is handled inside a mailable class. When you create a mailable in Laravel, you need to pass data into it so the email template can use that data. The way this works is you declare a public property at the top of the class, in this case, public $.con. Making it public means it's accessible everywhere inside the class, in the constructor, in the view, in any method. Then in the constructor, you accept a parameter, also called .con, and assign it to the public property using $this arrow .con equals .con. This is the standard pattern. When you call this class from your controller and pass in the shop data, that data flows through the constructor and gets stored in the public property, making it available to the email view automatically. You don't need to pass it again using compact or with, because it's already public. Laravel shares it with the view on its own. Now, let's look at how to actually send the email from a controller. The mail facade is used here. You call mail::2, pass in the recipient's email address, and chain .send with a new instance of your mailable class, passing in the data you want to include. Now, you could hardcode a static email address, but that's not ideal. Since the admin's data is already in the database, it makes much more sense to fetch it dynamically. Use admin::, first to get the first admin record, then access their email. If there are multiple admins, use admin::, all and loop through them with a for each, sending the email to each one. The DoCon variable, which holds the shop request data coming from the form submission, gets passed directly into the mailable constructor. This is how the email gets its content. To define what the email actually looks like, you need to create a Blade Vue file. Inside your resources/views folder, create a new folder called mail. And inside that, create a file named DoCon request notification.blade.php. The name must match exactly what you put in the mailable's content method. Now, here's an important gotcha. Tailwind CSS does not work in email views. Why? Because Tailwind is compiled by NPM when you run the dev server. That compiled CSS lives in your project's public folder and is linked in your main HTML layout. But when Laravel sends an email, it renders just that one Blade file in isolation. It doesn't load your full layout, so Tailwind classes have no effect. Instead, you must write your styles as internal CSS inside a style tag or as inline styles directly on the HTML elements. The instructor points out that internal and inline CSS are essentially the same thing for emails. Both work fine. For the actual email design, the instructor recommends using an AI tool like Grok or DeepSeek to generate the HTML quickly. The reason Grok is preferred here is that it not only generates clean HTML fast, but it also understands back-end logic context. So you can paste your existing code alongside the design request, and it gives you something coherent. When prompting the AI, describe what the email is for, paste your project's color theme values so the email matches your website's look and feel, and explicitly ask for internal or inline CSS only, no Tailwind. You can also paste your mailable class code so the AI knows what variables are available. One thing to watch out for, AI sometimes generates route references or links that don't exist in your project. Always review the output and remove or fix any invalid named routes, replacing them with plain URL strings instead. After generating the email HTML, the instructor ran into a common issue. The colors weren't showing up. The reason was that the AI used CSS custom properties like var-primary, which work perfectly in a browser but are not supported by most email clients. The fix is straightforward. Replace every CSS variable with its actual hard-coded hex color value. For example, replace var-color-primary with the actual hex code, like #4f46e5. A handy trick here is to use Ctrl-D in your code editor to multi-select all instances of a variable name at once, then paste the real color value in one go. The instructor walked through this for primary color, primary light, surface card, border light, and text soft, replacing each one. The rule of thumb is keep your color palette to 2 or 3 values maximum in an email. Using too many different variables makes the template messy and harder to maintain. Another small but important styling fix, anchor tags, that is HTML links, have a default blue color applied by email clients. Even if your surrounding text is styled correctly, links will show up in that default browser blue unless you explicitly override them. The fix is to target the A tag directly in your style block and set the color to your brand color, and set text decoration to none if you don't want the underline. You can do this either in the internal style tag at the top of your email template or as an inline style directly on the anchor element. The instructor noticed this issue when previewing the email and fixed it by adding an explicit A tag style rule. Always remember, email clients are not browsers. They apply their own default styles aggressively, so you need to be explicit about everything. To let the admin manage shop registrations, you need to create a filament resource. The command is php artisan make filament resource docon with the -- generate flag. This flag tells filament to auto-generate the title attribute, which makes searching easier. Filament creates 3-page files: list docons for the table view, create docon for the creation form, and edit docon for the edit form. These 3 pages are essentially wrappers. They call the table and form components that you define in the main docon resource file. The list page is the full table view. The create page is just the form input section. The edit page is also just the form, but for editing existing records. Understanding this structure is important because when you want to customize behavior, like hiding the create button or modifying what happens on save, you need to know which file to edit. One important customization is removing the Create button from the admin's list page. By default, Filament adds a New Record button at the top of every list page. But in this case, shop registrations come from the front-end website. Regular users fill out the registration form. The admin should only be able to view and approve those requests, not create new ones directly from the admin panel. To remove the button, go into the List Docans page file, find the Get Header Actions method, and comment out the Create action line. After refreshing, the button disappears. The instructor notes that leaving it there wouldn't break anything, but removing it makes the admin interface cleaner and prevents confusion about where registration should come from. Now let's look at customizing the edit form for the docon resource. 2 important changes are made here. First, the password field is removed from the form entirely. Why? Because the password should be auto-generated by the system when the admin approves a shop. It should not be something the admin types in manually. If the admin could type a password, it would get saved as plain text in the database, which is a security problem. The auto-generation logic will be handled separately. Second, the message field is changed from a regular text input to a text area component. This makes more sense for longer messages that shop owners might write. The text area also gets a column span full property, which means it stretches across the full width of the form low, while other fields take up only half the width each. The message field is also moved to the last position in the form for better visual flow. Here's a powerful Filament feature, the Mutate Form Data Before Save function. This function runs automatically just before the form data is saved to the database. It gives you a hook to intercept the data, modify it, add to it, or validate it, anything you want, before it hits the database. To use it, go into the Edit Docon page file and define a protected function called Mutate Form Data Before Save that accepts an array called data and returns an array. The function is marked protected because it's only meant to be called internally within the Filament record class hierarchy, not from outside. One important thing to note, unlike normal Laravel controllers where form data comes as an object, Filament passes the form data as a PHP array. So you access values using array syntax like data bracket password, not arrow notation. You must also return an array at the end. The instructor first used dd of data to confirm the function was actually being called, a good debugging habit. Inside the Mutate Form Data Before Save function, the first thing to do is generate a random password. Laravel's str::random method is used here with a random length between 8 and 12 characters using rand of 8, 12. This gives you a secure random string. Now, here's the key distinction. The plaintext version of this password needs to be sent to the shop owner via email so they can log in, but the hashed version is what gets stored in the database. So you store the plaintext password in a local variable, then add it to the data array using bcrypt, which hashes it. The data array is what gets written to the database, so the hashed version goes there. The plaintext version is used only for the email. This is the correct and secure approach. Never store plaintext passwords, but always send the plaintext version to the user once at account creation time. Now let's talk about authentication guards. This is a critical concept. By default, Laravel's web guard checks the users table when someone tries to log in. But in this project, shop owners are stored in the docons table, not the users table. So if you try to log in through the docon panel without setting up a custom guard, Laravel will look in the wrong table and authentication will fail. Each panel you build needs its own guard that points to the correct database table. The admin panel uses the admin guard pointing to the admin's table. The docon panel needs a docon guard pointing to the docons table. The process is copy the admin guard configuration, paste it, rename everything from admin to docon, and point the model to the docon model class. Then register this guard in the docon panel provider using the auth guard method. Once that's done, the login form for the docon panel will correctly check the docons table. Here's the step-by-step process for creating the docon guard. Open config/auth.php. In the guards array, add a new entry called docon with driver set to session and provider set to docons. Then in the providers array, add docons with driver Eloquent and model pointing to the docon class. This tells Laravel when the docon guard is used, look up users in the docons table using the docon Eloquent model. Then go into your docon panel provider and chain the auth guard method, passing in the string docon. That's it. The panel now knows which guard to use, and the guard knows which table to check.
The instructor emphasizes that as you build more panels in a project, you follow the same pattern for each one. Create a guard, point it to the right model, and register it in the panel provider. Only the users table doesn't need this because the default web guard already handles it.
Let's walk through the complete end-to-end flow to make sure everything connects. A shop owner fills out the registration form on the front-end website. Their data is saved to the database with a pending status and a null password. They can't log in yet. At the same time, an email notification is sent to the admin. The admin logs into the Filament admin panel and sees the new shop request in the list. They open the edit page, review the details, change the status to approved, and click Save Changes. At that moment, the mutate form data before save function fires. It generates a random password, hashes it, and adds it to the data being saved. The hashed password goes into the database. The plaintext password gets sent to the shop owner via email along with their login credentials. The shop owner receives the email, opens the Dukan panel login page, enters their email and the password from the email, and they're in. That's the complete flow. Clean, secure, and automated. A small but useful customization for the filament table. Set the default sort order so that the newest shop registrations appear at the top. This is done by chaining default sort onto the table, passing ID as the column and desk for descending order. This way, when the admin opens the list, they immediately see the most recent requests without having to scroll down. The instructor also cleaned up the table columns. The message column was removed because messages can be very long and look messy in a table row. The password column was also removed since it's null until the shop is approved, so it adds no value in the list view. The admin can always click Edit to see all the details. These small UX decisions make the admin panel much more practical to use. Let's wrap up with the key takeaways from everything covered in this session. For SMTP email setup, remember that mail mailer must be set to SMTP. You need a Google App password, which requires two-step verification to be enabled first, and port 587 is the standard choice. For email templates, Tailwind CSS simply does not work. Use internal or inline CSS. Replace any CSS variables with hard-coded hex values, and feel free to use AI tools like Grok to generate the boilerplate HTML quickly. For filament customization, the mutate form data before save function is your hook for intercepting data before it hits the database. This is where you auto-generate passwords, hash them, and trigger emails. Always auto-generate passwords rather than letting admins type them manually. And finally, for authentication guards, every panel you build needs its own guard configured in auth.php and registered in the panel provider. Without the correct guard, login will check the wrong database table and fail silently. The can access panel function, which adds an extra layer of access control, will be covered in the next session.